What was Immanuel Kant's Copernican revolution?
Just as Copernicus changed the center of our universe from Earth to Sun, Kant relocated the basic principles and categories of reality, as studied by science, from the external world to the mind. Like John Locke, 1632 to 1704, he began with an examination of the powers of the mind, and an aim to reject metaphysical claims that could not be rationally justified. He posited a human rational necessity to understand real experience in space and time and a practical need to live with other rational beings, seeking the principles that could fulfill those requirements. In 1770 Kant argued in On the Form and Principles of the Sensible and Intelligible World that our knowledge of space and time is only about appearances, but that we are still justified in making limited claims about what lies behind those appearances. This was the foundation for what became known as critical philosophy. Kant's revolutionary claim was that we have a priori knowledge of both space and time. Because they are the forms of our perception, space is the organization of experience in the outer world, while time is the organization of experience in the inner world. This was followed by the two editions of his Critique of Pure Reason. With his prolegomena to any future metaphysics published in between to respond to criticism.
What is anarchism?
Anarchism is a theory and political movement that is based on ideals of freedom and equality. All forms of domination, authority, and subordination are considered unjust and backed up by force. The state and all of its supporting institutions, as well as the institutions supported by the state, are deemed unacceptable. Society should be reorganized into small, self-governing communities in which members cooperate toward the same ends and produce their livelihood together. English journalist and political philosopher William Godwin, 1756 to 1836, initiated modern anarchism in the 18th century. And in the 19th, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, 1809 to 1865. Mikhail Alexandrovich Bakunin, 1814 to 1876, and Peter Alexeyevich Kropotkin, 1842 to 1921, were leading figures.
Who was Pierre Gassendi?
Pierre Gassendi, 1592 to 1655, was a Catholic priest who was highly influential in justifying empirical science to religious dogmatists. He studied at Digny and Aix and became professor of rhetoric at Digny when he was 21. After he received his doctorate in theology at Avignon and was ordained a priest, he became professor of philosophy at Aix. He also pursued astronomical research. His Exercitations Paradoxici adversus Aristotelios, 1625. Set out all that he thought was dubious and mistaken in Aristotle's writings. his principal attack on Aristotle was against the possibility of certain knowledge in science. Gassendi argued against Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE. In his claim that certainty was neither possible nor necessary in science. At the same time, he sought to defend atomism against church doctrine. Gassendi developed what came to be known as a mitigated or moderate skepticism that supported the conclusions of scientific inquiry.
What were Auguste Comte's sociological ideas?
Comte believed that in all the sciences, there are three historical phases: theological, metaphysical, and scientific or positive. The theological phase contains religious restrictions and belief in the supernatural. The metaphysical phase involves the justification of political rights above authority. In the scientific phase, solutions to social problems can be found. By combining these laws of phases, Comte developed an encyclopedic law, according to which all of the sciences could be ordered into a hierarchy in which sociology was the greatest and included all of the others. Comte wrote, "If it is true that every theory must be based upon observed facts, it is equally true that facts cannot be observed without the guidance of some theories." He thus posited an interconnection between facts and theories, which holds to this day.
What were the general ideas about women that were held by people in the 17th century?
The old Aristotelian idea that females were imperfect males was still assumed to be true in 17th century Europe. The modern science of biology, which established two distinct sexes, was still in the future. Although 18th and 19th century sexual distinctions based on biology supported the idea that the capabilities of women were inherently limited and inferior to those of men, they at least focused on the distinctness of male and female identities. The Aristotelian view has been called the one-sex theory. Many serious and well-regarded theorists of the human body solemnly insisted that the female reproductive system was no more than an inverted form of the male one. Like Aristotle, they believed that women were naturally colder and damper than men, besides being in every respect weaker. Moreover, women were considered to be the sex-desiring, aggressive gender, whereas men were often viewed as helpless and vulnerable in sexual matters. Medical opinion concurred that blood, semen, and spinal fluid were all the same basic vital substance or fluid, albeit in different forms. Sexual intercourse was not only often viewed as a weakening form of physical dissipation, but male ejaculation was believed to draw brain tissue down the spine and out the penis, a very strong reason for a male philosopher to remain celibate. Moreover, women were viewed as the source of venereal disease, unwanted children, and burdensome financial obligations. So great was their negative sexual power held to be that they were at the same time also presumed responsible for male impotence.
What was Neoplatonism?
Neoplatonism was an elaborate system of religious and intellectual belief that was based on ideas about the One as the unseen source of all existence, as a powerful but unseen foundation for everything in existence. The One was similar to Plato's forms.
How did the Pyrrhonic skeptics alleviate dogmatism?
Their idea was that once they showed that any contentious claim could be balanced by pro and con reasons and arguments, there was no reason to believe one side or the other. This was supposed to quiet the mind and make dogmatism impossible.
Why is Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed still considered a great philosophical text?
Maimonides, 1135–1204, addresses his guide to contemporary educated men who were intellectually torn between the claims of Greek science and religion. Maimonides' intention in writing seems to be to help his readers understand philosophy without giving up their religion, to weed out or not upset readers who lack the mental firepower to follow his reasoning. He said that he deliberately scattered Aristotelian insights throughout the text, instead of putting those together that first occurred together. He often stated both a position and its opposite. In other words, Maimonides' first step toward guiding those already confused was to deepen their confusion. But because Maimonides deepened existing confusion so brilliantly, his Guide of the Perplexed has attracted lasting scholarly disputation.
What were Friedrich Hegel's main ideas?
Hegel's system is difficult to describe because all of its parts are interrelated. And so to describe one aspect of it is to evoke all of the others. It is not clear exactly where an interpreter might begin. Hegel's order of exposition in the progression of his work is not a good guide because the structure of his system has to be presupposed in order to make sense of the progression. In other words, Hegel had his whole system in mind as he wrote about different parts of it. This said, there are several important elements that can be identified as Hegel's premises. Man has a history, but nature does not. All men do not have the same categories of fact. Human thought develops. Philosophy should give a rational account of religion. Social stability is possible after the French Revolution. Individual autonomy is possible in a unified society. The nature of things is a system, and a system of knowledge must reflect that.
Why was the idea of a manifest image important?
Whose analytic 20th century philosophers who explicated a manifest image of the world sought to reconcile the common view of the world with the scientific view. The term was coined by Wilfrid Sellars, 1912 to 1989.
What was alchemy?
The Latin motto of alchemy was Solve et coagula, which means separate and combine. Alchemy was practiced throughout the Christian, Islamic, and Jewish world until the 19th century and beyond. Traditionally, the central project of practicing alchemists was to discover how to turn base metals into gold. Second to this was a search for the elixir of life, which would cure all sickness and enable immortality. Medieval alchemists sought a philosopher's stone, which they believed would make both tasks possible. And they also worked on formulas for a universal solvent or aqua vitae. One form of aqua vitae has endured as a concentrated ethanol liquid, ethyl alcohol.
Who was Marie-Louise Enkendorf?
She was the pseudonym of Gertrude Keinel, George Simmel's wife, under which she published her own philosophical writings. The Simmels maintained a salon for intellectuals but otherwise enjoyed a conservative, bourgeois family life. They had one son.
Who was William Godwin?
Mary Wollstonecraft's husband, William Godwin, 1756 to 1836. Was well known as a novelist and political radical. In his Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, 1793, he advocated utilitarianism and anarchism. He believed that the institution of government has an artificially corrupting effect on individuals because it creates prejudices. He proposed that instead of large nation-states, humans should live in small communities without government so that they can get to know each other as unique individuals. Only then will it be possible for human beings to feel sympathetic regard for their neighbors. Godwin thought that, because there is no free will, there is no point in punishment. Virtue, according to Godwin, was based on sympathy. And sympathy motivates us to bring about the greatest happiness for the greatest number of human beings. Godwin had no use for other values beyond this happiness principle. He also thought that rights were unnecessary because sympathy could do the work of protecting everyone.
What kind of a Marxist was Jean-Paul Sartre?
In his Introduction to the Critique of Dialectical Reason, 1960. Sartre first claimed that his own existentialist philosophy was merely an addendum to Marxism as an historical process. But when he went on to explain what he meant, he said that the success of Marxist liberation for the oppressed would be necessary for the freedom he had described to be accessible to everyone. In other words, he saw the goal of Marxism as the realization of the very freedom he had described. In one sense, this contradicted his description of freedom as a universal human condition. But in another sense, Sartre believed that the oppressed have the power, based on their individual freedom, to unite and cooperate for collective liberation. So, although he embraced Marxism, he did not embrace its premise of determinism that the individual's consciousness is the result of the political and economic factors forming his or her social class.
How did Johannes Kepler and Tycho Brahe help complete the Copernican revolution?
Johannes Kepler, 1571–1630, composed a mathematically precise theory of the Copernican system, and Tycho Brahe, 1546–1601, furnished the measurements that constituted the factual data for the Copernican theory. Kepler's theoretical work was what completed the Copernican system. Kepler offered a religious explanation for the spacing of the planets and postulated a driving force centered in the Sun, which diminished with distance, as the cause of planetary movement.
He was educated at Yale, preached and knew. How did the Enlightenment affect the United States?
America did not develop its own philosophical tradition until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In the period before the American Revolution and the founding of the new republic, the excitement of liberty from oppressive government, the dignity of the individual, and rights to private property were all highly motivating ideas. These optimistic ideas were inspirational in the writings of Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and others. The American separation of church from state, as an article of individual liberty against oppressive government religion, and for free thought and speech came directly from Enlightenment ideas, as did the division of the powers of government and the distrust of government. It should be noted, however, that libertinism and outright atheism were to remain European phenomena for a very long time. Under the inspiration of Jonathan Edwards, 1703–1758, American Protestant religious philosophy flourished. In the late 18th century, in a New England born-again movement known as the Great Awakening, York City, and became a leader of the Great Awakening in 1729 in Massachusetts. His theology was a Puritan form of Calvinism. Edwards' interest in philosophy included Nicholas Malebranche, 1638–1715, the Cambridge Platonists, and John Locke, 1632–1704. He was himself an idealist, similar to George Berkeley, 1685 to 1783. Who held that human minds are made up of thoughts and sensations, God being the only true substance.
What were some noteworthy advances in medicine during the scientific revolution?
During the scientific revolution, William Harvey, 1579 to 1657, correctly described and demonstrated the closed circulatory system of blood. Robert Burton, 1577 to 1640, described, and lived out, the nature of psychological depression. With Harvey's achievement, the inside of the human body could be understood as an orderly mechanical, hydraulic system. With Burton's achievement came the recognition of mental illness as a secular, pedestrian process. Both achievements were practical and gratifying rewards for scientific investigators, as well as their public.
What are some important facts about Johann Gottlieb Fichte's career?
Fichte was appointed professor of philosophy at the University of Jena in 1794, where he extended his Kantian idea of duty to criticize the drunkenness, lewdness, and brawling of the students. In 1795 he became an editor of the Philosophisches Journal, and in the preface to an article he was going to publish that had been written by a friend of his, he wrote that God was the moral order of the universe. There were complaints that this was an atheistic view, and so the governments of Saxony and other German states suppressed the Philosophisches Journal and demanded that Fichte be kicked out of Jena. Fichte defended himself in writing and then threatened to resign his university position. The Jena University authorities interpreted his threat as an offer, which they immediately accepted, so he lost his position there. Much later, in 1810, he became the first professor of philosophy at the University of Berlin. Fichte's independent philosophy was first stated in Foundation of the Science of Knowledge, 1794, and popularized in the Vocation of Man, 1800. In 1796 he wrote Foundations of Natural Right, which was his treatment of natural law. In 1808 he gave a series of speeches to the German nation in French-occupied Berlin, published as Addresses to the German Nation in 1922. In those talks, Fichte supported resistance against French dictator Napoleon Bonaparte, arguing for the common good.
Who was Al-Ghazali?
Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, 1058 to 1111, was a philosopher, theologian, jurist, and Sufi mystic. Born in the Middle Eastern region of Khorasan, or Khorasan, and educated in the intellectual center of Nishr, he became head of Nizamiyat. a seminary in Baghdad, where his teachings in law and theology were renowned. He sought certainty in knowledge, and when he could not find it in his academic studies, he resigned his academic post, left his family, and became a Sufi mystic. He wandered for a decade and, as the result of those experiences, returned to Nishapur to resume teaching. Al-Ghazali came to believe that truth can be found only as the result of God's grace. In Deliverance from Error, his spiritual autobiography, he related his futile quest for truth and certainty through both Islamic and Western intellectual traditions and concluded that sensory information and reason were just as lacking. His alternative to rational and sensory knowledge was a light which God Most High cast into my breast. The key to most knowledge. His attack on philosophical authorities as a guide to truth and certainty, particularly in the writings of Avicenna, 980-1037, culminated in the intentions of the philosophers. And in the incoherence of the philosophers he offered a detailed intellectual attack on the views of Plato and Aristotle, which was again directed against Avicenna.
What are the major themes in New Philosophy?
Several factors stand out: a perceived need for philosophy to be relevant to current social concerns, the value of democracy, cultural pluralism, the importance of including women and non-whites who did not fully contribute to a history dominated by white males, and, above all, a strong revolt against ideas of objectivity, truth, and the perceived arrogance and hubris of previous philosophers. There is also a desire to make the subject of philosophy interesting to new students in a multimedia, electronic age.
Who was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon?
Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, 1809–1865, was the French social theorist who coined the word anarchism.
What was the purpose of Descartes' meditations?
In his preface and introduction to Meditations on First Philosophy, 1641, Descartes said that his goal was to rationally prove the existence of God and the immortality of the soul. He claimed to be able to do that using his method of clear and distinct ideas, which would also enable him to create foundations of certainty for the sciences.
What did Prodicus tell his audiences?
Prodicus of CEOs, c. 465–415 BCE, said that Empedocles' four elements of earth, wind, fire, and water were divine, a doctrine that the playwright Aristophanes, c. 446–386, made fun of in The Birds. He also thought that whatever was necessary to human beings was considered holy, which was not a traditional view of religion in ancient Greece. Prodicus argued that there is no absolute good, because what is good for one man is not necessarily good for another, a doctrine that supported relativism. In his discussions of language, Prodicus tried to show how no two words can have the same meaning. He also disagreed with Democritus, c. 460 to 371 BCE, who had said that there could be different names for the same thing.
What was Spinoza's philosophical goal?
Spinoza's goal was the very practical one of how a person ought to live in the world. He sought a good, or a value, that would allow independence from the unpredictable, unpleasant, and uncontrollable aspects of human life, and he concluded that the ultimate good was awareness of one's place in nature, together with an acceptance of the natural order. Natural science, politics, ethics, education, and even technology were part of what had to be understood to achieve this complete understanding. Before such understanding, Spinoza said that the human mind was like a worm in a bloodstream that thought each drop of blood was an isolated thing, instead of part of a system within an organism. His philosophical task was to describe the whole in which individual humans were parts.
What is experimental philosophy?
It is a very new philosophical approach that aims to use empirical information to back up the ordinary intuitions to which philosophers refer. People are given philosophical problems or solutions to them and asked if they agree with the philosopher's answer. Experimental philosophy has been applied to philosophy of language, philosophy of action, and intuitions that free will is not compatible with determinism.
What was Søren Kierkegaard's burning question?
For Kierkegaard, the most important question was whether there was a God, and thereby an afterlife. He did not think that question could be answered by any marshalling of the appropriate facts or through an intellectual process of any kind. It was a rational question, but there was no answer to it. The only acceptable answer was an actual leap of faith within and by the individual. Furthermore, insofar as the facts of the world rendered the possibility of God and an afterlife absurd, this absurdity itself is a test of faith. The more absurd something seems to be, the greater the faith necessary to believe it. Kierkegaard thought that great faith was the key to being a Christian. To this end, he deployed the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac. God commands Abraham to take Isaac up a mountain and then sacrifice him. This act is pathological in ordinary terms, but in religious terms. For Kierkegaard, it is the quintessential example of a leap of faith.
Who was Amos Bronson Alcott?
Amos Bronson Alcott, 1799–1888, was the father of writer Louisa May Alcott. He founded a school and a utopian community called Fruitlands. As a transcendentalist, he combined Platonism, German mysticism, and American Romanticism. He largely followed the teachings of the leading Unitarian minister, William Ellery Channing, who preached a gentle form of religious belief and practice, against Calvinism. Alcott's publications include New Connecticut, Tablets 1868, Concord Days, 1872, and Sonnets and Canzonets, 1882. Most of his other work is still unpublished, except for his vague Orphic sayings that appeared in the Dial, and which is representative of transcendental thought.
Why were ideas important to Berkeley?
An idea in this sense is a technical term, meaning some discrete thing in the mind. Berkeley's metaphysics began with the assumption that all we ever know are our ideas, which are in our minds. This is one reason why ideas are so important. We tend to assume that if we have a word for something, then we have an idea of it. But sometimes we fool ourselves, and our words are just empty with no ideas behind them. Therefore, we need to make sure that we actually have the ideas we think we have. Just because we are accustomed to using language in certain ways does not mean that all words that are intelligible to us refer to ideas. If we reflect on abstract, general words, such as man, whiteness, animal, or matter, it becomes evident that there is nothing in the mind to which these words refer. All of our ideas are about particulars or combinations of particulars. We lack the capacity to create new ideas. Only God can do that, although we are able to combine existing ideas in new ways and create copies of existing ideas.
Who was Wilfrid Sellars?
Wilfrid Sellars, 1912–1989, goal of combining analytic philosophy with logical positivism, resulted in his founding the journal Philosophical Studies. Educated at Michigan and Harvard universities, he spent his professional life after 1963 at the University of Pittsburgh. His work centered on the problems of reconciling the scientific worldview with our ordinary conception of ourselves as having minds and intentions in a world with meanings, sounds, and colors. Sellars developed his resolution in a union of empiricism and philosophy of mind, which introduced the philosophy of functionalism. His main books include Science, Perception, and Reality, 1963, Philosophical Perspectives. 1967, and Essays in Philosophy and Its History, 1974.
What was interesting about Voltaire's life?
Voltaire, 1694 to 1778, led a very dramatic life. After his classical education at a Jesuit school, he chose literature over law, and his subsequent satires resulted in his banishment from Paris as well as exile to Holland. He spent almost a year imprisoned in the Bastille. All of this happened by the time he was 24. Voltaire was believed to be the best playwright in France for half a century. A disagreement with a chevalier resulted in another sojourn in the Bastille, after which he went to England and learned the language, philosophy, and politics of that country. In 1734 he had to flee Paris again, and for the next 15 years he studied physics, metaphysics, and history with the highly intelligent Marquise du Châtelet, in Lorraine. During this time he was also at court, protected by Madame de Pompadour, who was the mistress of King Louis XV. Voltaire became historiographer of France and a member of the French Academy in 1746. In 1750 he was appointed philosopher-poet to Frederick the Great of Prussia, but they had disagreements after 3 years. Voltaire then bought a chateau in Geneva, Switzerland, and then an estate in France. In France he defended Jean Calas, a Protestant who in 1762 was tortured on the rack and executed. Voltaire was by then very rich and he devoted himself to causes against the oppression of the Church. When he returned to Paris at age 83, he was highly acclaimed, but died soon afterwards. He was first buried outside Paris, but then his remains were moved to the Pantheon, only to be again disinterred during the Restoration. Voltaire's body was never completely reassembled after that.
What historical developments helped to start Renaissance humanism?
The historical period of the Renaissance is usually considered to include the years from 1450 to 1600. This time is associated with the transition between the medieval and modern periods. From its beginnings in Italy, the Renaissance was marked by a new interest in literature, poetry, and painting, in a shift of attention from the mainly religious preoccupations of life in the Middle Ages to the secular, perceptible world. The Western world changed, along with this transformation of values, the Copernican revolution radically reconfigured the place of human life in the physical cosmos. Inquiries leading to the scientific revolution began. Seeds for nation-states were sown in political thought and action. The great age of exploration and travel by Europeans to Asia, Africa, and the Americas for adventure, science, and wealth began. All of these factors during the Renaissance changed the course of philosophy.
How did falsification work according to Karl Popper?
Popper, 1902 to 1994, postulated a hypothetico-deductive method. From the hypothesis together with descriptions of initial conditions certain future events or known past events could be logically deduced. If the hypothetico-deductive method were applied to the past, it worked as a form of explanation. If it was applied to the future, it was the form of prediction. Prediction and explanation thus had the same logical structure.
What is the Brights movement?
The Brights movement is committed to promoting public understanding and acknowledgement of the naturalistic worldview. Chicago biology teacher Paul Geisert and Manga Futrell. An educator who is also a board of directors member of the American Humanist Association and a former president of Atheists and Other Freethinkers. Founded it in 2003. Futrell defined a Bright as an individual whose worldview is naturalistic, free from supernatural and mystical elements. The Brights movement motto is illuminating and elevating the naturalistic worldview. The organization has three major aims: promote public awareness of the naturalistic worldview, achieve recognition that individuals who hold this worldview can behave in principled ways in important civic matters, and educate all members of society to recognize and accept the participation of Brights.
Why were Locke's views on religion influential?
Locke held a common-sense view of religion and advised toleration of competing sects within Protestantism. His toleration did not extend to Catholicism, however, although that did not diminish its force within the Protestant community. In The Reasonableness of Christianity, 1695, he allowed for the validity of revelation, but only insofar as it did not violate previously accepted facts or beliefs. He suggested that the Church of England could be reformed to attract dissenters by diminishing the power of its bishops, eliminating all mysteries, rituals, and superstitions in belief, and reducing its creed to simply an acknowledgement of Jesus Christ as the Messiah. In his letter on toleration, 1689, Locke argued against religious persecution of all kinds or any laws that interfered with those religious practices that would be lawful if they were not specifically religious. Part of his argument was the pragmatic one that suppression of religious beliefs unnecessarily breeds rebellion. His overall endorsement of toleration, particularly on the part of government, was to have a later influence on the separation between church and state in the U.S. Constitution.
Is Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative different from the Golden Rule?
Yes, it is. According to the Golden Rule, we should act as we would have others act toward us. If our tastes are perverted or we do not care for our own welfare, the Golden Rule could permit acts of depravity and violence, but such acts could never be willed categorically. Moreover, Kant's system is strongly based on individual good. Will toward the community of all other rational individuals. There is a debt to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's, 1712–1778, idea of the common good here. Indeed, Kant greatly respected Rousseau's moral philosophy.
What is known about Copernicus' life?
Nicolaus Copernicus, 1473–1543, also spelled Mikołaj Kopernik, was born in Turin, Prussia, in what is now Poland. He was educated in liberal arts, canon law, and medicine at the universities in Krakow, Poland, and Bologna and Padua, Italy. He received a doctorate in canon law from the University of Ferrara when he was 30. His uncle, the Bishop of Ermland, got him the post as canon of the Cathedral of Frauenburg in 1497. And he also served as physician to his uncle. Copernicus' job as canon involved diplomatic work and administration of church estates. He knew Greek and translated Byzantine poetry into Latin. He was knowledgeable about economics and developed interests in astronomy and mathematics. He became known for his astronomical observations and calculations. And in 1514 Pope Leo X asked him to help reform the calendar. Copernicus refused because he did not think enough was known about the motions of the sun and moon. Although he is widely reported to have contributed to calendar reform, nonetheless, Copernicus began developing his theories in 1512 and presented a short description of his system. Commentaria Luz, to a small group of friends. His major work, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelesium Libri 4, 1543, was published in the same year he died. At the time of his death, he also left a treatise on monetary reform. Monetae Kudendi Ratio, for the Prussian provinces of Poland. First printed in 1816, but written in 1526, this work advocated a uniform coinage, preservation of the quality of the coin, and a charge to the nobility for minting the coin. Copernicus anticipated Gresham's law, which states that debased money drives good money out of circulation.
What is consequentialism?
Consequentialism is the 20th century version of 19th century utilitarianism. The utilitarian moral system held that we should act so that the greatest pleasure or happiness for the greatest number results, with everyone counting for one and no one counting for more than one. G. E. Moores. 1873 to 1958, ideal utilitarianism specified that the goods we should seek as the result of our actions are aesthetic experiences and relations of friendship. Consequentialism is a more general form of utilitarianism that holds that we should act so as to bring about the best consequences, or act to maximize the results. Contemporary consequentialists often speak of preference satisfaction as the ultimate consequence that has intrinsic value. Preference satisfaction is getting what one wants. There is also discussion about the distribution of consequences. Whether it is better that all involved get equal shares or whether it is sufficient if the total good or average good is increased. Act consequentialism specifies that we should do the action that has the best consequences. And rule consequentialism specifies that we should do the action that is an instance of the rule that has the best consequences. All of these issues and others have been discussed in J.J.C. Smart, 1920, and Bernard Williams, 1929 to 2003, Utilitarianism, For and Against. 1973, and Samuel Scheffler's, 1951, The Rejection of Consequentialism, 1994. There have also been attempts to relate consequentialism to ordinary language philosophy. Most notably by R. Hare, 1919 to 2002.
What did John Stuart Mill think about Jeremy Bentham's pleasure principle?
Jeremy Bentham, 1748 to 1832, had introduced the idea that the only thing good in itself was pleasure. By the time Mill wrote his Ethics, this was widely known as Bentham's pleasure principle. Mill recognized the value of pleasure, but was more interested in happiness.
What happens after absolute knowledge is attained?
Friedrich Hegel's science is aimed at uniting Immanuel Kant's 1724 to 1804 system of transcendental categories to Aristotle's 384 to 322b. CE, Logic about the real world. Hegel divides his thought process into treatments of being, essence, and concept, which are each divided into 3 parts, and so on. The contradictions in each category of nature require resolution leading to the categories that succeed it. According to Hegel, nature itself has developed in a logical way, leading to ever greater abstractions in the form of our knowledge of nature. Hegel did not make clear distinctions between things in themselves in an ordinary realist sense, and our knowledge of those things. For Hegel, then, the progression toward more complexity in nature corresponds with a progression in human knowledge.
What were Isaiah Berlin's 2 concepts of liberty?
Berlin developed the distinction in his 1958 inaugural address as Sheikh Heel Professor of Social and Political Theory at Oxford University. Negative liberty is the absence of constraints or interference with individual action. As in a person being free to vote, write a book, or study ballroom dancing. Positive liberty is the human capacity for self-development and determination of one's destiny. For example, some people live in countries without negative liberties, which in turn hampers their positive liberty. Others with positive liberties may not be able to fully exercise them due to economic or social limitations. Berlin argued that, largely due to the Romantic and German idealist tradition, political theorists had been preoccupied with positive liberties as effects of particular forms of government. He believed that the idea of positive liberty was co-opted by both German National Socialism and communism. In the case of communism, the goal of liberty became identical to the goal of state control in the name of collective rationality. For the Nazis, it was the destiny of Germany and its master race that became an overriding value affecting individual lives. Berlin was an advocate of negative liberty in the tradition of John Stuart Mill. 1806 to 1873, which emphasized the importance of minimal government constraint. In other words, he did not think government was a viable source of values or projects for individual life. Plans because when government did assume that function it was likely to become totalitarian and repressive.
More develop his common sense philosophy.
More's first major article was The Refutation of Idealism, which was published in Mind in 1903. In it he argued that no idealist or skeptical argument was as convincing as common sense beliefs that the world is real, and that, therefore, idealism and skepticism can just be dismissed. More became famous for proving the existence of the external world with his legendary two hands argument, derived from his 1939 proof of an external world. Argument against skepticism concerning the existence of the external world. More said that by raising his right hand and saying, "Here is a hand," and then raising his left and saying, "And here is another," the skeptical position was disproved. This was not as offhand a dismissal as it seems. More's premise was that he knew he had two hands, from which it followed that the external world existed, from which it followed that there was no ground for the skeptic's doubt about its existence.
How did Gottlob Frege attempt to reduce mathematics to logic?
In his Foundations of Arithmetic, 1884, Frege argued that logic, or the laws of thought, are not descriptive of how we think and that words do not have meaning in isolation but only within context. Then in his two-volume Basic Laws of Arithmetic, 1893 and 1903, Frege began his project in earnest by showing that every predicate determines a class that can be described logically. For example, red is a predicate and red determines a class of red things.
How did Richard Rorty illustrate relativism to his audience?
Rorty, 1931 to 2007, practiced a highly sophisticated relativism that allowed him to present a position that his audience would agree with, and at the same time show how that position could be plausibly contested by those who held a very different position that was unacceptable to him and his audience. Concerning fundamentalist religious beliefs, for example, he taught views opposed to them with apparent strong commitment, and at the same time tried to show how his perspective was deeply offensive and even counterproductive in changing the minds of those who held those beliefs.
Why are LBGT studies and queer theory part of philosophy now?
They have become part of philosophy along with an overall interest in expanding cultural studies to include attention to issues previously neglected. This change has been part of the humanities, generally, and philosophers have focused on conceptual issues related to these fields. Queer theory emerged in the 1990s, along with LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual studies, as a positive affirmation of sexual difference that does not fit into any of its predecessor categories, including lesbianism. Good overviews on the subject may be found in Naomi Shore's Feminism Meets Queer Theory, 1997, and helpful works on transsexuality are Susan Stryker's Transgender History, 2008, and Laurie Shore's You've Changed, 2009.
What exactly was Parmenid's reasoning in his claims about the One?
Parmenides first assumed that reality, or what does not change, is one thing only. Given this, anything that is not that one thing is not real. Because something that is not real cannot have an effect on what is real, nothing can divide the one. The one, by definition, cannot move or change. Since the one is the only thing that is real, what we perceive as moving and changing is not real. Parmenides' student Zeno of Elea, c. 490 c. 430 BCE, defended the idea that reality is one and immobile and unchanging by showing how positing its movement and change results in absurdities. He is famous for his paradoxes. Melissus of Samos, fluid 440 BCE, added that the one is unbounded, or in our terms, infinite, and insisted that there could not be empty space.
Does Gorgias' conclusion that whatever is real cannot be thought make sense?
No, there is a gap in his reasoning. Just because thinking about a thing is no guarantee that the thing exists, does not mean that none of our thoughts are thoughts about what exists.
How did the Church react to Galileo's theories?
In an act that remains famous to this day, the Inquisition ordered Galileo, 1564-1642, to recant his theories and placed him under house arrest during the last decade of his life. Before that time, however, Cardinal Bellarmine tried for years to persuade Galileo to accept a compromise. The Church did not object to the Copernican theory so long as it was not claimed to be a description of what was true. The Cardinal told a friend of Galileo's that it would be acceptable if he claimed that the Copernican theory did no more than save the appearances, that is, provide a hypothesis from which astronomical observations could be logically deduced without claiming that Earth actually moved. Galileo was, in the end, forced to do exactly that. Although at the outset he refused to deny the truth of the Copernican theory as a true astronomical description.
Why did Pierre Gassendi promote mitigated skepticism?
Pierre Gassendi, 1592-1655, and his colleagues placed a high value on the new science of the time, which included the heliocentric, sun-centered solar system theory after the Copernican revolution. The atomic theory holding that the activities of all matter were determined by its smallest particles or atoms, and a rejection of those parts of the Aristotelian views of science that were in disagreement with these views. Gassendi's use of skepticism to attack Aristotle, and his use of moderate skepticism to support the new science, therefore made perfect sense. It helped Gassendi's cause that he was well liked and highly regarded among his colleagues in the Catholic Church, as well as by some of the more extreme skeptics of his day, and that he was careful not to go against church doctrine. Indeed, while defending the new science on the one hand, and insisting that no scientific knowledge could be certain on the other, Gassendi was able to live and think in both the traditional Catholic world and the new scientific one.
How did Denton Jacques Snyder interpret Friedrich Hegel?
Denton Jacques Snyder, 1841-1925, thought that Friedrich Hegel, 1770-1831, in the Lectures on the History of Philosophy, Berlin, 1820, and published as The Philosophy of History in 1858, was not able to achieve a full system of thought, but that his principle of evolution held the greatest promise for future philosophy. He read Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind, 1910, first published as Philosophy of Spirit in 1817. As a guide for how the individual can achieve total self-understanding through the analysis of his experience as a mirror of the history of his times. So the St. Louis Hegelians tried to analyze their own times as an expression of the absolute. There was thus a comparison between Hegel's vision of the absolute in Napoleon Bonaparte and Snyder's understanding of the U.S. Civil War and the end of the Great St. Louis illusion, which was shattered by the civic realization that Chicago had outpaced them in population. Snyder's insight that Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind is a book written in a romantic style, which destroys romanticism, has been considered subtle and sophisticated by his commentators. He meant by this that Hegel had a grand project but ran out of optimism about human history and the absolute itself.
Was Jonathan Edwards merciful toward sinners?
Not in the least. Jonathan Edwards thought that many humans were depraved and that a real hell awaited them. There is a tone of delight in these facts in his 1741 sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Edwards not only believed that sinners would be punished, but that God himself had no pity for their agony. He wrote, "If you cry to God to pity you, he will be so far from pitying you in your doleful case, or showing you the least regard or favor, that instead of that, he will only tread you underfoot. And though he will know that you cannot bear the weight of omnipotence treading upon you, yet he will not regard that, but he will crush you under his feet without mercy, he will crush out your blood, and make it fly, and it shall be sprinkled on his garments, so as to stain all his raiment. He will not only hate you, but he will have you in the utmost contempt. No place shall be thought fit for you, but under his feet to be trodden down as the mire of the streets. And, in so far as the virtuous strive to emulate God, Edwards felt it is fitting that they enjoy the suffering of such sinners in hell." In 1758, in his Why Saints in Glory Will Rejoice to See the Torments of the Damned, Edwards wrote, "When they shall see how miserable others of their fellow creatures are, who were naturally in the same circumstances with themselves. When they shall see the smoke of their torment, and the raging of the flames of their burning, and hear their dolorous shrieks and cries, and consider that they in the meantime are in the most blissful state, and shall surely be in it to all eternity, how will they rejoice?"
Ayre's version of logical positivism?
In Language, Truth, and Logic, 1936, published when he was just 26. Ayre forcefully and with great panache presented the main tenets of logical positivism as a doctrine broadly relevant to philosophy. He asserted the empiricist doctrine that all of our knowledge of the world comes from sensory experience. The truth or falsity of statements was dependent on whether they could be verified in terms of that experience. Only statements that could be true or false were meaningful. It followed from these bold claims that metaphysical, religious, and ethical statements if they were not true by definition, could assert nothing meaningful about reality. Statements about the self, the external world, and the minds of others had to be confirmed by sensory experience, if they were to be meaningful. Concerning the existence of God, for example, Ayer maintained that the question itself was not meaningful because no possible experience could determine its truth or falsity. Ayer's ethical theory was emotivist, that is, ethical judgments were held to be expressions of emotions.
What was Leibniz's monadology?
Like René Descartes, 1596–1650, Leibniz thought that the basic unit of existence was substance. But whereas Descartes posited two primary kinds of substances, mind and matter, Leibniz posited one immaterial kind of substance, which had many instances that he called monads. Monads, according to Leibniz, are indivisible units of psychic or mental or spiritual force, each one of which perceived all of the other monads as an aspect of its own inner states. Each monad had an organic body that mirrored what was happening in other monads, but not as a direct effect. That is, like a cell containing all of the chromosomes and genes of the animal of whose body it is a part. For Leibniz, each monad contained within itself complete information about the rest of world. In addition, every monad contained its own future states, and of course, within those future states would be the monad's perception of the future states of every other monad. This world system of monads was created by God, and its main feature is the pre-established harmony that results in human perceptions of direct interaction and interrelationships. Monads form colonies and colonies of colonies with dominant monads at different levels of organization. These collections of monads constitute real physical existence. Both space and time are abstractions and not substances. Space, according to Leibniz, is the form of possible coexistences, and time is the form of possible successive existence, things that exist.